Hello everyone, this is Bub and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. So if you've seen any of the other videos in this series, you probably know that I like to keep them medium neutral. And by that I mean, I try to keep my advice general enough to apply to any storytelling medium, whether that be novels, short stories, webcomics, video games, or tabletop role-playing games. However, today I'm going to break that rule by focusing on a few tips that apply specifically to live storytelling. Tabletop role-playing, in other words. I'm doing this because I've been a game master for years, I've run several games that have lasted for years, and in all that time I've learned a few things about the peculiar kind of improvisation the job demands, and I think it would be useful to share some of that knowledge. So, without further ado, let's get to the list. Number 1. Yes, but. In regular improv, the golden rule is called yes and. In other words, you should never shut down or deny what your fellow improvisers come up with. You should always accept their creations and then add your own thing on top. Of course, you shouldn't just accept improv that makes you uncomfortable or keeps you from having fun, but even then, your response shouldn't be to deny the improv. It should be to stop the session and explain why you're not having fun anymore. I know it sucks to be the party pooper, but it's important to let your friends know where your limits are. And if they're actually your friends, they'll listen to you. But I digress. As a game master, it's important to realize that your role in the group is at least somewhat adversarial. Each player controls one character, and the GM controls everything else. That includes all the challenges and enemies the players meet, plus it's your job to be the referee and make sure that everyone's following the rules. Thus, while the regular golden rule of improv applies to every player, the GM's golden rule is a little different. Instead of yes and, it should be yes but. Yes, your character can jump off the balcony, but unless they have a way to soften their fall, they're going to die when they hit the ground. Yes, you can insult the king to his face, but unless your character can explain themselves or get away quickly, he's going to order his guards to throw you in the dungeon. So, just like with regular improv, it's important to respect your fellow players and never shut them down directly. However, the game master is the source of conflict in a role-playing game, and so you should also never just let the players have something they want. Make them work for it. Let them know how dangerous it is to do the thing they want to do, because success is always sweeter when you have to earn it. Number 2. Write down your improv creations. Sometimes your players will enter a new town and one of them will go to the general store and ask you who the proprietor is. And you will panic because you didn't plan for this, and you will say something like, you see an old man bent over a walking cane who introduces himself as Yancey Drew, and his shop is called The Hullabaloo. You will then breathe a sigh of relief because your player is now satisfied and will get on with shopping. But that's not necessarily the end of the story, because 5 sessions later your players will return to the town and ask for old Yancey. And you, having forgotten all about the character, will transform Yancey Drew from an old man into a flirtatious young woman, and her shop is now named the Blue Lagoon. In this instance, it doesn't really matter whether the shop owner is young or old, male or female, but it's still a frustrating moment, and it's one that you could have avoided by writing yourself a short note. All you'd need is something like, Yancey Drew, old man, owns general store, Hullabaloo. And with that, you'll be able to bring the character back just as he was the first time. Plus, developing this habit won't just save you from moments of embarrassment, it can also build your world, and it can help you keep track of more important details, like which player character currently has the Ring of Sauron, or which noble families have the players insulted, and which ones have they helped. Number 3. Pay attention to player interests. It can be hard to predict which characters and which aspects of your game your players will latch onto. Sometimes you spend hours crafting an NPC with a detailed backstory and a strong motivation to support the party, but then the players spend 2/3 of the session that he's introduced in chatting to a random woodcutter with a funny accent. So, does that mean you need to punish your players or force them to get back on track? Far from it. It means you need to do more with that woodcutter. For instance, what if the woodcutter turns out to be the important NPC's cousin, someone who wanted a simple life but can get dragged back into the conflict by the players? Or what if the woodcutter is just some guy, but that guy can let the player characters sleep at his place while they're in town? Or he could even travel with them for a time, since he knows the local woods so well. If the players show interest in something that you come up with on the spot, then you should reward them and yourself by giving that something a bigger part in the story. You don't have to change the story to make it about the thing, but in most cases, it's not hard to give it a bigger supporting role. You should also watch out for moments of negative attention. By that, I'm referring to moments where you introduce something new, but a player is disappointed because it's not something else, something that they were hoping for. You don't have to change the thing you just introduced to please your players, not if that wouldn't make any sense, but what you can do is write down what the player is hoping for and then work that into a future adventure. That way, you don't have to compromise your story, and you can still make all of your players happy. Number 4. Random tables should guide, not direct. There are a number of role-playing games that feature random charts and tables for things like monster encounters, magic items, planes of existence, and more. Look online and you'll find even more random tables that cover just about any object, character, or situation you can think of. And these tables can be quite useful, both when you're planning an adventure and when you're running one. However, some GMs lean on random tables a little too heavily. They're a good tool for coming up with ideas when you don't have any, but you shouldn't let the dice create the story for you. You'll get an interesting story, that's for certain, but it'll also be disjointed and simplistic, with no real setup or payoff. So if the dice give you a result that makes no sense or leads you in the wrong direction, then roll again. You're not cheating, you're creating a story. And when you're the GM, that's more important. Number 5. Know when to roll. Something I've seen a few game masters do is call for a roll every single time a skill comes up. And that does make a certain amount of sense. Dice and risk are the game part of a role-playing game. However, the other thing you're doing is telling a story. And sometimes rolling the dice will put that story at risk. And I'm not talking about moments like the hero is hanging on to the ledge with one hand, the villain is cackling above him, roll one last time to climb up to safety. If the hero falls and dies in this scenario, you won't get a happy story, but it's definitely a dramatic ending. What I'm talking about is the hero knows the villain was here, but only her footprints remain. Roll to track where she went. If the player rolls poorly, you're stuck. The story can't continue. That's why it's sometimes better to not roll at all. Just let the story happen. If a task would be easy for a character to do, then let them do it. If a piece of information is important, then let the players have it, without rolling any knowledge checks. If a player asks to do something impossible, then explain why it's impossible without stringing them along. I said earlier that you should let the players choose their own actions, but even in regular improv sessions, you can't just reverse gravity or turn people into cows without explaining how or why. And if you must roll, then use success and failure to determine how long it takes them to do something and not whether they can do it at all. Number 6. Use reference photos. Describing the environment can really help you immerse your players in your setting. However, it's not easy to describe something you've never seen. That's why it helps to give yourself a visual reference, a painting, an illustration, or a photograph that you can look at and try to describe instead of picturing something in your head and trying to describe that. You'll still need to add other details like sounds and smells, but at the very least, you've given yourself a head start. Number 7. Embrace the supporting role. When you tell a story using a role-playing game, the players are the protagonists. In fact, they are the only protagonists. You, the game master, can play as the supporting cast, the cameos, the extras, the environment, and the antagonists, but you will never play a protagonist. Not so long as you're the GM. And since we all play the protagonist of our own personal stories, it can be hard for some folks to adjust. But look at it this way. Being the protagonist means nothing if there's no story to be the protagonist of, and that is what you provide. Your job is not to tell a complete story with no player input, and it's not to defeat the players, it's to make the players look good. Let me use an analogy. The host of a party never has the same experience as the guests of a party. You have too many responsibilities. Keep the alcohol flowing, make sure the snacks are available and clearly marked for the guests with special dietary needs. Lock up the rooms you don't want guests wandering into, keep certain guests separated so they don't ruin each other's nights, and so on. It's a lot of work that many of your guests won't even notice, but if you pull it off, then everyone will have a great time and they'll all know that you were responsible for it. But if you make the party all about you, then the alcohol that isn't yours will run dry, a guest will eat the wrong snack and end up in the toilet all night, someone will steal your medicine because you forgot to lock it up, and the two guests who hate each other will get in a big fight that spoils the mood of the entire night. You might still enjoy the night, but because you ignored your guests, no one will come around for the next party. Number 8. Stay open to suggestions. It's easy sometimes to isolate yourself in the role as game master. No one else has to do what you do after all. However, another name for tabletop role-playing is collaborative storytelling. And so while you have the most control over the story, everyone at the table is a contributor. You are the head writer, but they are also on the writing staff. And while you can get a lot from your players by paying attention to what their characters do and what they want, you should also drop out of your GM persona now and then and just ask them, person to person, what they want from the campaign and what you can do to deliver it. If you don't want to interrupt the storytelling, then save the questions for before or after the session. But make sure you ask. It really can be that simple. Improvisation is not a skill you can develop in isolation. It's one of those things you can only really learn by doing. However, there are still some tips and tricks that can make the learning process easier, and that's why I made this video. So while this subject might not apply to everyone in my audience, for those to whom it does apply, I hope it was valuable. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.